Hi, I'm Kyle Swan. I direct our Ethics Center here on campus. It's called the Center for Practical and Professional Ethics. This is our annual fall ethics symposium, but it's not the only thing we do. Please take a peek at our website and see what else we have on store later in the semester, later in the academic year. Welcome to session 3 of our ethics symposium on the ethics of hope and change. I turn things over to the session chair, Brianna Pham.
Thank you so much, Dr. Swan. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Brianna Pham, and like the other session chairs at today's symposium, I'm a student in the Consumnes River College Honors Program. After this introduction, this session will consist of our main speaker's presentation, which will be about 40 minutes. After that presentation, we'll hear briefly from our formal respondents, to whom our main speaker will get the chance to reply. Finally, we'll open the floor up to you, our audience. Please note that this event is being filmed for broadcast for the Sacramento Educational Cable Consortium. Our speaker for this session is Kyla Scanlon. Kyla is the founder of a financial education company and a creator who writes a weekly newspaper on Substack, makes YouTube videos, hosts the Let's Appreciate podcast, and posts almost daily short-form videos about the economy and the markets. She has worked with Bloomberg, New York Magazine, the Financial Times, and the New York Times, as well as many other major publications. She is the author of In This Economy, How Money and Markets Really Work, which was just released earlier this year by Crown Currency, an imprint of the Crown Publishing Group, a division of the Penguin Random House. Her presentation to us this afternoon is entitled In This Economy, echoing the title of her book. Please join me in welcoming Kyla Scanlon.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me at your symposium. I've never been to Sacramento before, so it's very cold. I was not expecting that when I got here. But yeah, I'm going to talk about the economy today. I'm going to talk about economics, and I'm going to talk about how to make it relevant to you. How many people in here have taken an economics class before? Okay, so most everybody, which is great. I'm going to do it a little bit differently than the pure academic way. And I don't have slides. Normally I do present with slides, so if I mess up, this is my first time doing it without slides, so forgive me. But so for some background on me, my name's Kyla. I grew up in Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky, if you're familiar. I went to Western Kentucky University and triple majored in finance, economics, and data analytics, and graduated in 2019. I sold cars when I was in college, and that was when I first began to really care about economics. I don't know if anybody has had the experience of purchasing a car, but it's terrifying, right? Like you go in there, you're having to deal with somebody who wants to sell you a very expensive item, and you're learning how to negotiate right on the spot. And that's when I really began caring about economics education, which is what I do in my work now. I make daily short form videos, as Brianna said, on TikTok, on Instagram, etc. And my first book did come out earlier this year. But the reason that I think economics education is so important, and then the reason that I think everybody in the room should be thinking about it, is that a lack of economic literacy cost Americans $388 billion in 2023. So not knowing how to buy a car costs people a lot of money. Not knowing how to maybe budget for groceries or how to save for a 401k was extraordinarily expensive for people. And it's not anybody's fault. We oftentimes just don't have proper economic education opportunities. Gen Z has the lowest levels of financial literacy than any generation, and it's something that's just quite not fair. And so what I try to do with my work and what I do with the various talks that I do and the book that I wrote in the videos that I make is to try and close that gap. I think everybody would probably appreciate an extra $388 billion in their pocket. And I'll talk a little bit today about the economy. I'll talk specifically about the attention economy, so what it's like to interact with the phone and social media on a daily basis. I'll also talk about demographics, so the aging of the US population and how important that is to consider. And then I'll talk about how maybe we can fix some of the issues that we're facing. Of course, we're in a very tenuous time as a nation with the election coming up, so all this could be prone to change, but these are just general ideas. And the basic idea of the presentation, the main thesis, if you will, is you can't fix a system unless you understand it, right? So if you see all these problems with the world around you, you have to know what's causing those problems in order to begin fixing them. And I'm hoping to provide you with a little bit of information on that throughout the presentation. So what's the state of the economy? So as I'm sure most of you are familiar with, inflation has been a massive problem for the past couple of years, mostly because of the supply chain dynamics of the pandemic. Everything got very expensive very fast. My grocery bill went up like $20 a visit just because things got so expensive, because supply chains broke down, because boats couldn't go where they needed to go, and everybody was stuck inside. However, inflation has mostly abated over the past few years, months, years. We now are in the spot where inflation has basically moderated, where prices are not going up as fast. But this is an important economic lesson because when you hear that inflation is going down, oftentimes people will think that means that prices are going down. But inflation going down just means that things are getting expensive less fast. It doesn't mean that things are actually getting cheaper. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind when we have this conversation and you go to the grocery store and you're like, but my cereal's still $7. I heard that inflation was going down. It's actually an important word and an oftentimes misunderstood word. But we're seeing a lot of progress on inflation, primarily because supply chains have recovered. And how many people in here are familiar with the Federal Reserve and the work that they do? Okay, so kind of like half the room. So the Federal Reserve is the main government-adjacent body that's in charge of managing inflation. So they have a dual mandate of price stability, which you can think of as inflation, and maximum employment, which is the labor market. So they want to make sure that things are not extraordinarily expensive, and then they also want to make sure that anybody who wants a job can get a job. And those are two really hard tasks to achieve. I can't imagine having to wake up every day making sure that things are cheap and that jobs are plentiful. It's a lot of work. But how they manage the economy is by raising and lowering interest rates. So they basically make it more or less expensive for you to be alive by making the cost of money more or less expensive. So with the inflationary period that we had, the Federal Reserve was raising rates because they were like, we want people to calm down. We want people to not be spending so much money. So ultimately, the economy slows down, so hopefully inflation slows down. Most recently, they actually cut rates, and so we're actually seeing a different part of the economy right now where inflation has slowed down, as I said earlier, and they're like, okay, we can let some air into the economy, we can make it easier to take out an auto loan, to take out a mortgage, just financing things is a little bit less expensive. And the labor market is another important thing that the Federal Reserve considers. That's their maximum employment mandate. And you all are, I think most everybody in here is a college student, so I imagine you probably want a job after you graduate. And they do everything they can to make that work, but it's definitely a tough time for the labor market. I'm sure many of you have seen the headlines. The unemployment rate has ticked up a little bit. The labor market was quite strong for a while, but it is harder and harder for young people to get a job, especially after graduating school. But hopefully with the rate cutting cycle that the Federal Reserve is doing, it'll make it a little bit easier. And of course, when you look at the economy as a whole, GDP growth, so gross domestic product, that's been growing. The economy itself is doing quite well. We had the CHIPS Act, which helped invest in US manufacturing. We had the Inflation Reduction Act, which gave a lot of money to a lot of different projects. And everything is going okay, right? The economy is doing perfectly fine. nobody, that's like, that doesn't feel true, right? To say that, like, the economy is doing perfectly fine, that doesn't really resonate with anybody. I don't think anybody necessarily agrees with that. And I don't know what everybody's personal experience is in the room, but the economy is an extraordinarily personal experience. Everybody has their own inflation rate, everybody has their own interaction with the labor market, everybody has their own interaction with buying a house. In California, it's quite hard to get a home, but in a state where I'm from, like Kentucky, it's a little bit easier. So that's, everybody has that own personal interaction with the economy, and that changes how they feel about the economy. But a big thing has been that people will say that the economy is doing fine, but most people will say, well, no, it doesn't feel that way for me. And that's actually really important, that disconnect between data, which is something I'm sure you all learned about in your classes, like the numbers really matter, and sentiment, how people feel, which is like a little bit more floofy, like it's less quantitative. But that disconnect between data and sentiment is really important. And it's something that you have to consider when you talk about the economy. And the reason that this disconnect happens, why the economic data will be relatively okay, but people don't feel okay, is because of structural affordability. So who in here would like to buy a home one day, to buy a house? That's less than I imagined. So that's the American dream, right? Like when you're growing up and you're a kid, I think most people assume that they'd like to buy a house. That's the main way to build wealth in the United States, is buying a home. That tends to be the dream. But buying a house is quite difficult. Homes are very, very expensive, as I think most people know. The median home price went up by over $55,000 between 2021 and 2022, which is more than the median worker made that year. So if you had a house during that time, you're like, wow, like I just made a ton of money paper-wise on this house. But if you're trying to get into the housing market, it's definitely a different story. And that's quite difficult, right? If you can't achieve the American dream, it feels difficult to move up the economic ladder to achieve dreams, to do what maybe your parents and grandparents did before you. There's also other issues with structural affordability, like elder care and child care. So on average, elder care, so caring for an aging parent or grandparent, costs $5,000 a month, which is more than I think most people pay for rent, probably double what most people pay for rent. And then childcare, which is taking care of kids, is up 32% since 2019. And so those are the three things that are really impacting how people feel about their economic circumstances. So you all are, I think, mostly pretty young, but there's a group of people who are Gen Xers mostly, who are called the sandwich generation. And they're dealing with both aging parents and kids. And so they're dealing with all of that, childcare costs being up 32% since 2019. Paying, maybe $5,000 a month to take care of their elderly parent, all the while, like trying to manage this housing issue that we all face. Another statistic, and I know you're not supposed to say a ton of statistics in presentations because they're hard to remember, but I think this one is important too, because boomers own 28% of all 3 and 4 bedroom homes. Millennials with children own only 14%. And so there's also that issue where a lot of people have golden handcuffs. So earlier I was talking about the Federal Reserve, how they were raising rates, making it more expensive to be alive, so ultimately inflation would go down. But that also made mortgage rates go up. So a lot of people were able to get into the housing market and get like a 2% mortgage rate in 2020, and now mortgage rates are above 7%. And so if you have a 3-bedroom house, you don't really want to move, take on a new 7% mortgage when you have this maybe 2% mortgage locked in, or if your house is already paid off. So we have this big demographic discrepancy in housing as well, where boomers own a lot of the homes, and millennials with kids who might want a 3-bedroom home don't. And that prevents economic mobility. And that's the goal, I think, of everybody is, every day just having a little bit of better economic circumstances than you had yesterday. And so that's point number 1 of this disconnect between data and sentiment. structural affordability. The second point is the closure of commercial real estate. I don't know what your town looks like here in Sacramento, but where I live in Los Angeles at the moment, and where I used to live in Kentucky, a lot of office buildings are closed. You know, you walk down the street and it's like every other store is closed. Like there's a lot of vacancies, and I don't know what it's like here. But that's a big thing in a lot of cities because during the pandemic, a lot of people were like, oh no, I can't afford the rent on my commercial real estate. I can't do this. And so we have a lot of closed businesses because of that. But when you're walking down the street and you hear on the news that GDP is up, inflation's down, the economy's doing so great, but then you see closed businesses, that's definitely a disconnect between data and perception and what you're actually seeing. And then the third point is news. So I'm sure everyone probably reads the news or at least checks in with it. And news sentiment has actually declined over time. I have this really cool chart or graph that I wish I had on the presentation screen, but basically just imagine a box and then imagine a line going down, and that's what's happened to news sentiment over time. It's gotten more and more negative. And so the things that we're reading about the world around us have gotten extraordinarily negative. The information that we're absorbing is negative. And so of course that's going to impact how people feel about their economic circumstances and how they feel about their ability to move up in the economy. And this gets into the next part of the presentation, which is about the attention economy. So how many people in here use social media? I apologize, I don't have visualizations on the presentation. I know that helps. So most people in here use social media. Who likes using social media? Okay, let's hands on who has it. And so that's a big thing, is like people will use social media. I'm this way. You use social media, but you're like, I don't really like what this is doing to me as a person. I feel like maybe I'm comparing myself to other people. I feel like I'm not really seeing the forest for the trees. This feels weird. I feel like I'm constantly being sold to all the time. And the point of this symposium is to talk about the loss of trust, right? The loss of trust in institutions. There was a 2024 Harvard Youth Opinion poll that talked about the loss of trust specifically for young people, It talked about the loss of trust specifically for young people. And young people lost trust in basically every single institution. So you all lost trust in basically every single institution except for the United Nations. They lost trust in the president, they lost trust in media, they lost trust in the Supreme Court, everything. And social media only amplifies that because of what we were talking about earlier with the negative news sentiment. That's a big part of it as well. So there's loss of trust, Harvard Youth Opinion poll pointing that out. And then there's things, and this is not picking on Mr. Beast specifically, but how many people in here know of Mr. Beast? Okay, so cool. Great. I've spoken about him before, and somebody was like, what are you saying? So Mr. Beast is the most successful Gen Z person ever right now, for better or for worse. And there was this really interesting leaked memo. I don't know if anybody saw it, but it talked about how he sees the attention economy and how he sees everyone watching his videos. And he sees everybody through the lens of retention and through views. And he's like, how can I make people watch something longer? And his videos, for those who don't know who he is, he makes things like, I survived in a nuclear bunker for 100 days, or real life Squid Games, or like, I gave everybody on the street $1 million. And those are all extraordinarily interesting topics, right? Like you're probably gonna wanna click on them and check it out. But Mr. Beast is kind of this perfect example of the attention economy, right? When you compare this Gen Z leader to maybe a Steve Jobs or another, I was gonna say Jeff Bezos, but like Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos, like these other leaders that were extraordinarily successful, Mr. Beast has gotten very successful by focusing on metrics versus meaning, right? And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's not a value judgment. But when we think about the attention economy, when we think about the loss of trust, when we think about all of those things, it can really erode how people feel about the world around them, because you feel like you're constantly being sold to. You feel like your eyeballs are constantly being harvested for another hit of dopamine, the world is asking you for something all of the time, and that's pretty tiring. I always have this, it's not even a joke, but your eyes are the most expensive things that you own. Like even if you own like a really nice handbag or like really expensive shoes, like your eyes are actually very, very, very expensive because people will pay a lot of money to acquire your attention. And you have the whole world at the tips of your fingers. Like, it's funny, like even just being up here on stage, like you could have 1,000 other things that you could be doing with your time, right? And so like the cost of time is really, really high. And that all ties into the attention economy as well. And, Mr. Beast's loss of trust, the harvesting of attention for ad sales, ultimately, that all shapes how we perceive reality. There's another term called reflexivity, which was created by George Soros. And it's this idea that the actions that people take or the ideas that people have ultimately can influence actual reality. So if people are like, I think this thing is going to happen, you can actually make that thing happen if enough people believe it. That's a very reductive explanation of his work, but that's an important thing to think about too. Is if enough people believe in the power of the attention economy, or enough people believe what they're seeing on social media and what they're seeing in the news, there can actually be some manifestation of that reality. Manifestation, of course, is like kind of a woo-woo word, but it's true, and this sort of stuff has been documented, the power of sentiment. And that's why when we talk about the disconnect between data and sentiment, it's so important to consider the sentiment part. And you can kind of see reflexivity taking part in the prediction markets versus the polls. I won't talk about elections in general here, but prediction markets versus the polls are actually quite interesting. So prediction markets are basically what the market sees as the probability of a certain event happening. So if you go and check like in a site like Polymarket or a site like Kalshi, they'll give you the odds of what the market thinks whatever event is going to happen will happen. Polls are a little bit different. They're asking people what they think will happen. But both can kind of create this self-reinforcing or this self-fulfilling prophecy. What's been happening with Polymarket is that candidate Trump has basically trended quite positive on Polymarket. And so you're seeing the US stock market respond to that. And you're starting to see people begin to make trades according to a potential Trump presidency. And that's the idea of reflexivity. That's also the power of the attention economy, the power of narratives, and the power of sentiment. Nobody knows what's going to happen. I believe in a week or a week and one day from now, nobody knows what's going to happen, but everybody's paying attention. And that sometimes that's more powerful than any set of data. There's also other things that can influence prediction markets. Whales are a big part of it. So basically like really rich people can come in and manipulate the markets and kind of wave that sentiment one way or another, which is very interesting. If anybody's looking for like a research paper, that's a really interesting topic. There's also the issue of low liquidity, so it's easier for whales to do this, and I'm just getting a little bit technical. But there was a Wall Street Journal article talking about this difference between prediction markets and polls. And they said that prediction markets were the most efficient political ad, the most effective political ad. So just seeing something happening in these prediction markets, which are basically the odds of something happening, it's not even the reality, it's just the probability, that's enough. That's enough to maybe sway people in one direction or another. And that's the power of sentiment, that's the power of the attention economy, and that's the power of reflexivity. And so all of that is kind of surface level, like what is happening with our eyes and where our attention is going and how powerful your attention is, especially as a collective. And I also want to talk a little bit about, this is kind of, I thought I had a good segue for this part, but I don't think I do. I'm gonna talk a little bit about demographics, and I kind of hinted at it a bit earlier with the baby boomers and how many homes they own. There's this really interesting Gallup poll that talks about how people who are over the age of 65 will consume most of their news via TV. However, younger people, you get most of your news via social media. And it actually creates this interesting disconnect in narratives where people might be hearing a completely different story on TV than people are hearing on social media. And it's kind of this fragmentation of reality where everybody's living in their own little bubble and you never really have to go outside of that bubble. And the fact that we're getting our information from such polarized sources creates that polarization. It creates it where we're all going apart from one another in a way that is becoming quite noticeable. But getting a little bit into the demographics, the population is aging and the fertility rate is far below the replacement rate. So basically we're not having enough children to replace the population to keep up with it. 25% of the US population will be over the age of 65 by 2030. And of course, that's a lot of people, and that's a lot of people who will need probably some form of social assistance. Of course, that's what is expected, and that is what should be done. But when we think about the issue, right, it's basically like we're going to have a lot of people who need a lot of help, and we're not going to have a lot of people who are going to be able to take care of them. And so the main way that you grow a population is you either have more kids or you let more people into the country. And both of those are political hot points, but immigration is a very powerful source of economic growth. It was actually the sole source of the growth of working age population from 2021 to 2022. It was the only way that the US working age population expanded was immigration. And so when we think about demographics, a lot of it is childcare, making sure that people who have kids have the kids taken care of. Childcare has gone up 32% since 2019, as I talked about earlier, and that is unsustainable. A lot of people are not having children because of the cost and because of the housing situation. And that is something that is not going to be very good, and it's going to make it a little bit difficult for the country to continue to grow. And so that's one part of the demographic issue that we're facing. You know, we have this sort of narrative disconnect between the many demographic groups, but then there's also the issue of the aging population as well. That is just something to take into consideration when we think about policy and when we think about the economy. Another important thing to think about is the foundation of the economy. When we have this conversation about demographics and when we think about how to grow an economy and the power of immigration, is that a lot of, I was at USC last night and I was on a panel there, and Manuel Pastor, who I believe is a professor of sociology there, had a really interesting point where he talked about tech companies and how tech companies would not be able to function without the care economy, without gardeners and nurses and nannies. And basically, there's a foundation of the economy that has to be considered. And we don't do a very good job considering it. It's people who might not have the opportunity to have a college education, who might not have the opportunity to have a lot of economic mobility, but they're definitely something when we think about the demographic issue, we should consider that as well. So how do we sort of fix these issues? So I was bouncing around a little bit, you know, going from a disconnect between data and sentiment to the attention economy to demographics. And I'm a really big fan of government spending. That's like super unpopular to say because a lot of people will say that the government can't spend a lot of money, that the government has to be careful, that the government does a very bad job at spending money, which can sometimes be quite true. But when we think about government spending, the important thing to consider is productive government spending. So right now, the government is spending quite a bit of money on interest payments. And so basically, just like you and I have like a credit card percentage, like, or, you know, an APR, the government has that same sort of thing on the money that they borrow. And theirs is quite high because the Federal Reserve was raising rates, as I said at the beginning of the presentation. And that's made the interest payments that they've had to pay quite high as well. And so they're spending a lot of money on interest payments right now. And that's not a good way for the government to spend money. But if the government can spend money productively, which, you know, childcare, elder care, housing, building more housing, etc., could be considered that, that's probably a good way to spend money, and I think what a lot of people would want. And a lot of it too does, from a policy perspective, does boil down to retraining, reallocating investment. So I worked on this project with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, where it was called the Commission on Reimagining the Economy. And they had all of these policy proposals that are quite easy to implement, that you can go and check out the photo book online. It's quite interesting. But there's a lot of solutions to the problems that we're facing. It's just incorporating them. And then the final thing that I want to talk about is a paradox between wealth and prosperity. And so in all of my videos online, I talk about the economy. I've done work with White House and Treasury and big companies and small companies. And I've talked to a lot of people about the economy for the past 3 years, which is how long I've been doing this job. And I think the hardest part about the United States, in a lot of ways, is that we're a very rich country. We have a lot of money, but not a lot of people can experience that prosperity, right? It does feel unevenly distributed sometimes. And there are ways to fix that. But that is kind of the issue with the US, is that imbalance, right? And I think the point of this presentation is to talk about the state of the economy, to talk about some of the issues that we're facing as a society, which is the fragmentation of our realities through the lens of social media, the reflexivity, the importance of having a shared reality and the power of shared reality, then of course the demographics that are underlying the foundation of our economy, and then the broader goal of realigning wealth and prosperity. So I'm a little short on time, but I think 30 minutes is okay. So is it all right if we jump to the Q&A? Great.
Thank you, Kyla. We'll now hear from our formal respondents before turning to you, the audience, for questions. Our first respondent is my fellow CRC Honors peer, Maya Venturia.
I first wanted to start off with saying thank you for that very insightful talk. You've given us a lot to think about. I think that the economy is one of the American systems that can be very overwhelming and daunting in general, but especially for those with little economic literacy. And unfortunately, like you pointed out at the beginning of your speech, a vast amount of those with little economic literacy are young, despite young people being some of the people who need that knowledge the most. Fortunately, your talk has provided people with knowledge of the economy, specifically its key indicators, their application, issues with its data, and ways to solve them, so thank you. I have 2 questions for you. The first question is indirectly related to your talk. The second question is more directly related to your talk. So the first one is a lot of organizations that gather economic data use surveys, but in recent years, response rates have dropped harshly. For example, the Bureau of Labor and Statistics are having issues with finding respondents for their JOLTS survey, which is Job Outcomes and Labor Turnover Survey. So what do you suggest that private and public organizations do to combat this drop in response rates? And my second question, which is more directly related to your talk, is that within your talk, you talked about a disconnect between data and public sentiment. You mentioned that this disconnect results from structural affordability. I was wondering if you could expand more on structural affordability, as in what it is and what defines affordability and structural affordability.
Yeah, so it's really interesting that you bring up survey data, because that's one of my favorite things to talk about, is that the data that we sometimes use to talk about the economy is not accurate. And I have this amazing chart that I can't show you all because it's not here with us right now. But basically, it's the same sort of thing as what I was talking about with the sentiment, is that it's all of these major economic surveys, and it's the response rate, and it's just down. It's just down. So JOLTS is a big one. There's several others on the graph. And so I think a big issue with economic surveys is that there's been a loss of funding, which has bizarre. This is the way that we look at the economy, and I think it probably should be funded properly. But there's a lot of power in private market surveys, which is what you also mentioned. So Redfin and Zillow, which are two major housing market companies, are actually very good data sources on the cost of US homes and the cost of rent. And they're incorporating a lot of that data into analyzing some of the government statistics as well. But the biggest thing with the survey drop is it's you have to get people to respond, and that's really tough. It's really tough to get people to do things, and businesses just aren't interested in doing it anymore. And for the sentiment survey, the University of Michigan sentiment survey, which is one of the main ways that we gauge how people feel, they used to call people on the phone, and they didn't stop doing that until a couple months ago, and they switched to web-based surveys. And now the response rates are crazy. Like people, not crazy, but like a little bit not what we would expect. Like people are saying that inflation is going to be 17% because all you have to do is just go on the web and submit. And so there's a lot of headaches with surveys and polling. But I think the biggest thing is just more money to the government, which is an unpopular thing to say, but more money to the government agencies that are doing this really important work. And then to the point of structural affordability. So the structural affordability is a word that Talman Joseph Smith, who is at the New York Times, and I kind of like coined together. And basically the idea is that there's this part of being a person in the US economy that is structurally very difficult, but structurally you have to participate, like housing, for example. It's just kind of like what you have to have, and it's the foundation for how we interact with the economy, is housing. And the other parts of structural affordability are elder care and childcare. And the reason that we call it structural affordability is because it is like the underlying structure of what a lot of people have to deal with. But it's also things that are very expensive that might not be showing up in traditional economic data like GDP. Like the cost of a house, it shows up in GDP, but the pain of a cost of a house doesn't necessarily. And so that's what I meant by structural affordability, and that's what I think about surveys. Did that answer your question? Great.
Thank you, Kyla. Our next respondent is my fellow CRC Honors Program classmate, Kane No.
I'd like to also, again, begin by thanking you for the amazing insight and also making it a lot easier for my generation or other generations to consume economic data or understanding it. And also, I want to go back to one of your questions you asked about the office space market in Sacramento as well. There was recently a building in downtown Sacramento that was previously worth around $80 million, and it was recently purchased by a Sac State alum, Ethan Conrad. And he purchased it for $20 million. So it's dropped about $60 million in the past few years. But I want to talk about specifically the way we measure if we're in a recession. Talking about specifically how the GDP doesn't necessarily take into account environmental degradation, resource depletion, waste pollution, or quality of life, and a lot of the wealth distribution in our society. The upper 10% owns most of it. I want to know if you have any suggestions for how we can better measure those economic key indicators. And also, my second question is about the loss of trust within my generation, other generations that have towards the government. Specifically talking about how when we first had one of our major recessions in 2008, there was a lack of transparency that the government gave to many American citizens, and they started shelling out a lot of mortgages with varying rates, but they didn't really account for how often people are purchasing them or other factors including that. But also that lack of transparency led to a lot of distrust within my generation and generations before us. How do you think we can rebuild that trust in our government system?
So you're asking, considering climate change, considering all of these issues that might not show up in economic success, like how do we incorporate that? Yeah. And then you're also asking, we have a loss of trust in the government because there was a lot of bad actors how do we fix that? Is that kind of the gist? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of people are really paying attention to climate change, and rightly so now, because of the devastation of the 2 hurricanes that wrecked the East Coast. I think a lot more people are quite concerned. But I think when we think about economic success and the climate, there are some ways to consider it, but it's never a top priority, it seems. Like oftentimes we put the climate to the side and say, oh, you know, grow the economy at any cost. I think that a lot of academics have been doing a lot of amazing work, and I don't know any specifics, but I know that there's a lot of papers out there that are like, how can we think about economic growth in light of climate change? Some movements are movements like degrowth, where they're like, we don't need to grow anymore. I think there's maybe more of a balance, but there is a lot of really good work out there. I just can't speak to the specifics. And when we talk about the loss of trust in government and the bad actors of 2008 and perhaps over the past few years as well, I think that's a thing that a lot of people are thinking about right now. How do you rebuild trust in institutions? It's something I think a lot about, because I think trust is really, really expensive. And once you lose it, it's really difficult to get it back. Like even when you get into a fight with a friend, you know, it's like, and they don't trust you anymore, it's really difficult to fix that. And it's the same way on a much bigger scale with the government. And I think the biggest thing is transparency, as you said. I released this survey to my audience a few months ago, and I asked them this question. I was like, how do we fix, you know, this big issue that we're facing where nobody believes anything anymore? And they were like, just tell us what's up. Like, just tell us the truth. Be a little bit transparent about where the money's going, what people are doing, what people are thinking. And I think that's a good place to start. And yeah, that's a good place to start. It's just being more transparent about where tax dollars are allocated, what we're building, and what policies are being created. So
Thank you, Kyla. Our final respondent is Dr. Gail Pooley, Professor of Economic History at Utah Tech University.
Oh, this is working? Yeah, it sounds like it's working. Okay, great. Well, great presentation. What's the name of your website or your ex?
my ex.
Yeah.
It's at Kyla Scanlon, if you want to check it out.
Okay, so we need to have that on your slide. At least maybe a QR code that we could all scan and get to it. So it's very fascinating, your kind of discussion about attention. And in my talk, I talked about this idea of equality of time, that we all have 24 hours a day. And there was a quote that I actually wanted to share with you, and I didn't have time to. Maybe I'll squeeze it in here. It's from Carl Sandburg. He said, "Time is the coin of your life. It is the only coin that you have, and only you can determine how it will be spent. Be careful lest you let other people spend it for you." So I just think that once again, what really is going to become scarce in the future is our time and our attention. And maybe if you could kind of chat a little bit about that. There has been this little bit of a movement to try to figure out how to charge advertisers I'd love to be able to charge an advertiser to watch their ad. Like, you want me to watch your ad? It's going to cost you $1 or 10 cents or whatever. Is there anything that you can think of or that you've worked on that would allow us to maybe better monetize our time, so it's not, a way that we can somehow charge people for our time and attention better than we do now, because it seems like other people are making those decisions for us?
I don't think this mic works. Oh, it does. Okay, great. Yeah, it was the one that. Sorry. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. So time and charging advertisers and better monetizing our time. This is something I think a lot about as somebody who does make videos on social media. You are asking a lot of people's time when you do anything online and when you do anything ever. And I think the biggest thing is, there's a saying that I think a lot of people have probably heard, where if the product is free, you're the product. And that's kind of the problem that we have, is that we have a lot of, free things that aren't free because they're harvesting data. And there's even been pushback on like Meta and Facebook, which is owned by Meta, to be like, hey, Facebook, you should pay people for taking their data and selling it to advertisers. Like, they probably should have a little bit of money from that. Like, why do you get to keep all that money? And it's very interesting because Google, which is this gigantic company, and I don't quote me on this, but I think like over 80% of their revenue is like ads. Like, they're just so successful from selling things to people. Not even selling things, but selling space so other people can sell things. And so that's a very good question. Like, how do we sort of flip the script? But I think the model of tech right now is that everybody is the product. And now with AI, it's interesting because you have to pay a subscription for most AI products. And you're still kind of the product. So not only are you paying, but they're being, ultimately trained on the information that you're giving them. And so I think this problem is only going to get worse before it gets better. But that's why I think trust is so important. Data is so powerful. Our sentiment is so powerful. And I don't have a great answer. I really wish I did. But I think it's something that we're going to have to get sorted, especially when we consider what could happen with AI in terms of data and content.
Thank you, Kyla, and thank you, Dr. Pooley. We'll now turn to our audience for questions. Dr. Swan will moderate this portion of the session.
Thank you for your talk. On the point of living in a fractured society, and going back to like the structural, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the term for it. You called it structural economy?
Affordability.
Structural affordability. It seems that we are living in a fractured economy when you look at those structural affordability points, especially when you consider that housing is how most people generate wealth in this economy. And that because of the interest rate hikes, housing, the cost of housing per month has raised significantly. And then when you also look at, because again, going back to that 32% increase in childcare, like it seems like we are genuinely living in a fractured society when a portion of the economy locked in those low interest rates early on and isn't paying for childcare, while the younger people have higher interest rates, higher childcare costs. So it's just like we've almost come to accept it, but it seems like there's two very different takes on this economy.
Yes. Yeah, there's people who are living very different lives in this economy. And so I think, so there's wealth inequality and then there's income inequality. And so income inequality in the US has actually improved. So lower wage workers have actually seen their incomes increase for the first time in like forever, which has been really great. But wealth inequality, which is like the assets that people own, has actually decreased, partially because of this housing crisis that we're facing. And there's this really interesting graph from the Federal Reserve called the distribution of financial assets. And if you look at this graph, again, I wish I had it on screen, but the bottom 50% of Americans have all of their wealth tied up into their house. So that is the main way to make wealth if you're in the bottom 50%. But if you look at the top 10%, all of their wealth is tied up into business ownership and stock ownership. So they own a small business and they own stocks. And so when you think about that, like there's a clear answer to sort of like how do we close the wealth divide is not having people have their house as both a speculative asset and a place to live. It's helping people invest in the stock market. It's helping people join things like employee stock option programs, which are basically a way that you could have ownership in the business that you work for, right? And so instead of, the CEO making 300 times all the workers might have a stake in that business and be able to benefit the same way that the CEO might from the increase in that business. And so we do have a very, very fractured economy, and we have a very visibly fractured economy. Like I run on the Strand in Los Angeles, which is in Venice. And you have people who are sleeping on the sidewalk right next to $1 million homes. And that's not something that should exist. That's not something that should be accepted, considering the wealth that the US has. But again, it's that paradox of prosperity. We have so much wealth, but we don't have prosperity. But when we think about the actions that the everyday person can take to maybe close this wealth inequality gap, just without even passing policy, it's assets. It's thinking about owning stocks, not investment advice, or employee stock option programs, et cetera.
Thank you very much for the talk. Yeah, it was interesting, fascinating, clear. I'm looking over my notes on what I'm seeing you saying, and you're talking about structural affordability and how housing and childcare and elder care is too expensive, and that news sentiments are getting more negative, and social media is hijacking our dopamine systems, and young people have lost trust in full institutions, yada yada. And I'm looking here at the hope and change, and like I'm wondering if you can find something in what you've talked about to emphasize. Is there anything that you see that to be hopeful for? Is there any positive upends to all of this that we can take something positive away from?
I don't think talking about things that need fixing is at all negative. I mean, I think this is like what I've always thought about is that you have to have the privilege to talk about the good stuff, the privilege to talk about hope. But to get there, you do kind of have to talk about the bad stuff. And I think that's kind of what I should have been more mindful of the title, but I think that's what I try to do is like, hey, like there's a reality that people are facing. And it is tough and it is hard. But just because things are tough and hard and difficult doesn't mean that it's always bad. It just means that things are tough and hard and difficult. And so I think that the way that I would hopefully, and I might have totally miscued my presentation and not done a good job presenting, but the way that I would want the presentation to be taken away is that there are tough things that are happening, but there's so much to be hopeful about. There is policy change that can happen. There are actions that we can take to fix wealth inequality. There are things that we can do to address childcare issues. The attention economy is something within itself. But so I apologize if that happened.
I didn't mean to suggest that you were being negative. I think you've done a nice job of balancing the tonally. I suppose maybe the way of rephrasing the question might be something like, do you see any trajectories that are moving in a positive direction?
I think a lot of economics has a lot to do with politics. And so it'll be difficult to figure out anything until about a week from now. Because we have two very different economic policy proposals. Like, a flat 10% tariff is going to be very different economically than, incorporating at-home care into Medicare. And so I think that there is a lot to be hopeful about in general. Like, humans have, what I always say, and I think what a lot of people say is like, humans have survived this long. Well, it's sort of arrogant to think that something like this can take us down. But yeah, there's always something to be hopeful about. There's a lot of innovation happening. A lot of people are starting small businesses. We're seeing some relief in the housing market. But of course, there's tremendous uncertainty, and that just kind of happens every 4 years at this point.
Okay, so back to the paradox thing. Why do you think homelessness persists in wealthy societies? As you mentioned, when you walked in Venice, you've seen homeless people. So why do you think that persists in wealthy societies like America, which has huge amounts of money?
Yeah, I think for the United States, we don't incorporate it into our like values almost. Like, I think most people obviously don't want something like that to happen, but we kind of like let it happen, and we try to provide care, but it doesn't always end up working. And so I think the biggest thing is that we just don't know how to fix it. And there's a lot of different causes of homelessness. Like, a lot of people will be homeless because they're not able to afford housing, but we also have an opioid epidemic, like where I'm from in Kentucky. That's a massive issue where people are stuck on the streets because they're stuck with drugs. And so I think there's so many different causes to homelessness and people not being able to have housing or get proper care institutionally or medically. And we kind of seem to throw up our hands sometimes. But there's so many amazing groups that are doing amazing work to try and fix it. I just think the problem has gotten overwhelming, especially in a place like California where housing costs are so high, and it really creates a lot of issues. Yeah.
I was wondering I was thinking about how a lot of people in our generation online seem to be growing more and more radical and like falling into like these very like polarized, like either on the left or on the right, not just politically but like economically. Just like seeing how a lot of people seem to be turning to communism or like these very like alternative, like just any alternatives to capitalism. I was wondering if you've seen any like research to see if that's really a concern or if that's just kind of like the internet. That makes sense.
Yeah. So you're like, it seems anecdotally that a lot of people are going towards either end of the extreme. Is that actually real, or is that just something that happens online? Is that kind of the gist? Is that right?
And if it is really happening, like what that would kind of mean for like our society, if we have enough of if Gen Z has enough of an impact to like alter like economic policy to like something more like not crazy but like more like different than capitalism, if that makes sense.
Sure.
I'm not wording that right.
No, it's okay. So you're like, can it work? Yeah, basically. Okay. So the question was like, online, it seems like a lot of people are going to either end of the extreme, whether it be socialism or maybe another end of the extreme. And number one, is that true? And then number two, can that actually happen? And I mean, this is like such a cop-out answer, but anything can happen, I believe. I think that there's a lot of institutional framework around capitalism. There's a lot of big businesses. The stock market makes it so that's kind of how it is. The Fortune 500, S&P 500. So I think that's kind of like the way it might be for a while. But the way that young people are acting online, I think is totally makes sense. Like when we think about a loss of trust, of course that's going to come with young people taking some sort of action, whether it be one side or the other. And so I do think that's happening. There's a lot of polls, asking young people what the most important thing to them is, and it's not like what you would think it is. Most of the time it's like inflation. It's not pure politics. So I do think when we think about online spheres, the reaction to certain things is always a little bit more extreme. There tends to be more extreme noise because you're, of course, competing on an algorithm and you want to attract as much attention as possible. But there's a lot of different schools of thought about economics. In my book, I talk about all this stuff, and I have a whole chapter dedicated to like the different ways that we could have an economy. And what it would look like to see the world through that lens. And so I think it's always possible, and things always change. Empires don't last forever, and I don't know when, and I don't know what. There's academics who have done amazing research on it, but I think number one, we tend to see more reactivity online, and then number two, I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I wonder if you could speak more to the lack of transparency and what people are exactly experiencing as the lack of transparency.
I think the lack of transparency is mostly things happening around you and not having a general sense as to why, or not feeling like certain policy has been passed that's supportive to you. I think for a lot of people, like in the UK, for example, they outline where your tax dollars go. And so you have a sense of like what your taxes are being spent on. In the US, we don't really do that. And so I think that's like a big part of the transparency is just like, well, where's the money going? Like it seems to just be disappearing. Like what's the government spending money on? And a lot of my work is actually to help improve that transparency because the government is doing a bunch of work. The US Treasury has done a lot of amazing work on housing supply. which isn't something that you would expect. And so a lot of it is just information transmission. So the information is out there, but it might be difficult to access, or it might be confusing to access, or it might just not be interesting to people, and so they don't seek it out. And so I think number one, it's like the government could probably do a better job telling people where things are going. And then number two, the information that is out there probably just needs to be a little bit more accessible. And that's where that lack of transparency and the desire for transparency does come from.
Hello. So earlier I believe you said that an effective way of closing our nation's wealth inequality gap is by giving the lower and middle class more investment opportunities as an alternative to the current system where their main investment is often their home, which they kind of expect to grow in value. And what do you think are some specific policies and actions that can be taken to allow this to happen?
A big one would probably be baby bonds. So this used to be something that we had a long time ago, and I'm being reductive in the explanation, but basically it's like babies get bonds, and so they get something that will mature over time, and they'll make some money off of that. Like they get a portion of government debt, and so I think that's a big thing. Is like people who are in the U.S. economy have some sort of baby bond. A lot of people will advocate for, and this isn't necessarily what you asked, but like universal basic income is a big one too. So like having some sort of foundation for people to have income is a big way. There's already some policy-ish kind of around stock ownership, like 401ks. A lot of companies will match what you invest in your retirement plan. And so that's one way to do it, is like having a matching amount of money being put into what you put into. And then I think employee stock option programs, like I talked about, are interesting. They're pretty hard to execute and very difficult. But really, it's just about having people either have access to that money quite early on, giving them the opportunities to do so, encouraging employers to do it. And then, having different policy be around to be supportive to those things.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, yeah.
So my question is, how do we know that financial literacy is not like something that's also, financial illiteracy is not something that's also experienced by other generations as well? I agree with you. Sorry.
Yeah, no, you go. Go on. Yeah, sorry.
I agree with you that Gen Z does have a higher financial illiteracy rate. But I'm curious as to what makes it different from like boomers or Gen X when they were in their 20s. What makes it that Gen Z is more financially illiterate than back then?
So every generation does have problems with financial literacy. I think the rate of like financial literacy for millennials is like 42%. For Gen Z, it's 38%. So nobody is doing quite well. I can't remember off the top of my head what it is for the other generations, but this has been a problem forever. And I imagine that for boomers and Gen X, the financial literacy issue is probably relatively the same, but I think things might have been a little simpler perhaps. Now, and I could be totally wrong in this guess, but I think now with things like student loan debt, the housing situation, having to finance that, having to figure out a first job. During the boomer time, there was a lot more unionization, and that made negotiating wages a little bit easier. And so I think it's always been a very, very big issue, but I think the economy is a little bit more complex now, and financial literacy has sort of fallen to the wayside, despite best efforts from people like the Council of Economics Education. So I think it's just a problem across the board, yeah.
Hi, the gentleman sitting next to you. Hi, can you please re-say that quote? The time quote was very good.
The Carl Sandburg quote.
Oh, yeah, that's it.
Sure. Time is the coin of your life. It is the only coin you have, and only you can determine how it is spent. be careful lest you let other people spend it for you. You can Google it. You can Google what? Yeah, Google it up. Carl Sandburg, time. It'll come right up. There's a part of a poem, I think, that he wrote too.
Hi, thank you. I have a question for you. You touched on it a little bit, but I just wanted to follow up and ask, what are some steps young people can take to become more financially literate or create a foundation for a financially stable future?
Yeah. I specialize in economics education, but I mean, I think the biggest thing is budgeting. Like, there's a really great group called YNAB, You Need a Budget, and they do charge a fee per month, but they help you like kind of get your budget in order, provide lessons as you're doing that. And I think that's a really good thing, like just taking advantage of the platforms that, number one, allow you to learn on the platforms, but then number two, give you like actual actionable takeaways versus like making a T-chart or something. And so I think that's like the biggest thing. There's a lot of really good books out there talking about this sort of stuff. Scott Galloway, who is a professor at NYU, just published a book called The Algebra of Wealth, and that's quite an interesting read. It's anecdotal too, so it's always easier, I think, to learn through somebody else's experience. It just contextualizes things a little bit more. And so I think those are the biggest things, is like, there's a lot of platforms out there. Acorns is another one, where if you spend money, they put away, like they round it up to the nearest dollar, and if you like spend, I don't know, like $4.50 at the gas station, they'll take the other 50 cents and save it for you. And they have a lot of good financial education resources too. So number one, the platforms, and then number two, maybe seeking out reading. But I think the platforms are good. Yeah.
Kyla, what do you make of the things I sometimes hear to the effect that Gen Z is in some regards simply less practically minded than some previous generations were? That there were previous generations that determined what they would study at college if they went to college, what job they would get based on economic prospects, as opposed to less economically driven considerations like how much I like this subject.
So you're asking, is Gen Z passive? And then also how?
I wouldn't put it in terms of passivity. I'd put it in terms of having values other than economic values.
Oh, sure, yes. Yeah, I mean, I think that's like, so I'm technically Gen Z. I just turned 27. And I think, so I'm older one, but, and old. But I think the biggest thing with the younger generation is optionality. And so like for boomers and Gen Xers, you kind of had like a couple paths that you would go, and that was like it. And if you went off the beaten path, everyone was like, what are you doing? But there's so much room for optionality, and there's so much room to do crazy jobs. Like my job makes no sense. Like if you had told somebody 20 years ago that like, hey, she makes videos about the economy on TikTok, people would be like, what's TikTok, right? And so now there's just so many different ways to have a career path and so many different career paths to have. And I think for the younger generation, I wrote a piece for Fast Company like about this specific topic, where it was like, what does it mean to like, have a career that matters to you? There's a really interesting deterioration between employer and employee. And for younger people, I think they kind of pick up on that, where, for your parents, maybe you worked at the same place, they worked at the same place for like 40 years. For younger people, there's not that promise anymore, right? Like when you go and work at a company, there's no promise that they're going to keep you for 40 years. In fact, it would be quite weird if they did. And there's not the same sort of pension system. Unions have been on the decline. And so I think there's just a gap between maybe how people used to work and the expectations of the employer and what employees can expect. And so I think people are more willing to go after their passions because it's like, well, I can be an entrepreneur. I can figure out how to do this. I can make money from, doing things online. And that's why we see people go after their passions versus maybe go after a traditional career path. Because number one, the traditional career path might not pay off because things are rapidly changing. And then number two, there's so much opportunity outside of doing it traditionally. Does that answer your question?
Yes. I take it you're suggesting in part that there needn't be a difference in values here insofar as there are a difference in options. We get a difference in choice and outcome.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe the values are the same, but yeah, just a different path. At this talk that I was at last night, Manuel Pastor, who I referenced earlier, he kind of talked about this too, sort of the decline of mentorship. And I think that's influenced how people think about career paths. There's a lot of pulling the ladder up behind people versus maybe taking the next generation with them. And you feel that when you're a young person. It doesn't feel very good. And so I think like it is sort of an optionality thing, but it's also a shift in the workplace. Like there's this really interesting New York Times article that talks about how for the boomers, their whole, and this is, generalizing, but their whole experience with social life was at work, versus Gen Z, it might not be that way. And so I think there's just like this big shift in the workforce happening right now. Everybody's trying to figure out what's going on. Nobody knows what's going on. And it's confusing. Yeah.
Hi. You spoke about elder care and child care and housing costs. And I'm imagining situations where those three overlap, like when 3 generations are living together under one roof. And so I just wanted to ask you, to what extent are those 3 variables complicated in societies like ours, where geographic mobility is so easy, but it sometimes pulls the generations to different parts of the country? So maybe, grandpa and grandma are not able to live in the same house as their grandkids, whereas in some other, types of arrangements, that's the norm.
And so you're asking the cost of that?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it comes with a pretty high cost. The number of generations living under one roof has declined, where it used to be quite normal to have like grandma and grandpa move in and help take care of the babies. And so I think that has definitely exacerbated the cost of everything, because it would be that like grandma and grandpa would take care of the kid, and then grandma and grandpa would get taken care of by the family, and then you don't have to pay for either elder care or child care. And that's no longer the case. And with both elder care and child care, a lot of the cost is labor costs. So it's very expensive to run a child care facility because there's a lot of regulations, and rightly so. But it's just very, very expensive, and the margins, the amount of money that you can make on running a child care facility are not very high. And so you kind of have this like catch-22 with the child care facilities and the kids who need care, where the child care facilities are like, we have to continue to raise our prices, like we're not making any money, and the families are like, it's already so expensive. That could potentially be fixed by multi-generational living, but I'm not. I don't know how we would address that at a policy level.
With a mind to economic education, if you could teach like one idea, one core concept, one theorem, one anything to the entire world, to future generations, just something to put on a bumper sticker, or they could take away from them, that you think would make the world a better place if people understood this, what would it be?
So I don't know if the answer is very good, but people are the economy is something I really like to say. I think it's really important that people understand that everything they do is an economic interaction. As like silly as it sounds, like buying a cup of coffee, sitting in this room, when I bought this notebook, when I bought this pen, like all of that's economic. And it's all driven by people. Like the only reason that we have an economy is because of people. And so I think that's just important to consider. And a lot of the work that I do is the thesis that if people understand the world around them a little bit better, they'll ultimately make better decisions. If they feel part of the economy, hopefully that'll help with some element of cohesion, and then hopefully the world's better off, right? Like if people understand the world around them, they're gonna feel a little bit better, right?
I don't think that's silly at all. I think it's a fantastic answer.
That was not good to lead with. Like I think my idea is silly.
There was a time that K through 12, high school in particular, offered coursework like home economics, in which folks were taught to do things like budget.
Yeah.
We don't do that anymore. Do you have a sense of why we stopped doing it, and whether there's any interest in doing it again? And everybody's paying attention to it, seems to agree there's a financial literacy problem.
Yeah.
Do you see any serious discussion about addressing it at the curricular level, K through 12?
Yeah, so I spoke at the Council of Economics Education like a month ago, and they're the group that designs curriculum for K through 12, and that curriculum is in 35 states, but when I talked to them, they were like, it's just not resonating with people. And I think that's like the biggest problem with economics is that it can feel so abstract sometimes, and it's difficult to like personalize it in a lot of ways. And a lot of people do a lot of amazing work personalizing it, but I think this is just like a broad issue that I heard from the council. And then I think to the point of, home economics. So this is kind of funny. I didn't know you could major in economics until I got to college. I had no idea. Like when I was in high school, I had no clue. I didn't know what economics was. And then I got to my freshman year at WKU, and I took a general education course in economics, and I was like, oh, this is really cool. I didn't know this was a real thing. This seems wild. And so I think there's a lot of people that were like me, where once they get exposed to it, it's quite interesting. But you have to get exposed in the right way because it is really delicate, it is really personal. And so the council is doing a lot of amazing work to try and get that curriculum into schools. I try to do what I can with the book and with social media. But the biggest thing is just trying again and again until something works, because I think the way that we're teaching it K through 12 right now, I think some teachers have figured out what to do, but broadly speaking, we just haven't, yeah. But it's very important.
Session 3 in the books. We only have left to thank our third speaker. Thanks.